we are back. Everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Shift with Gina. Thank you for being here. The last episode got a little bit more engagement and traction than I kind of expected. I talked about the ballerina farm controversy. She is a very well-known social media influencer, and there was a lot of conversation about her postpartum phase after her 8th baby and going to the beauty pageant and all that. So I'm glad you guys liked the episode. Thanks for all the comments and engagement. I love to hear your thoughts on everything. I really do, even if sometimes they're dumb thoughts. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that it's dumb thoughts. Even if there are things that I don't particularly agree with or strongly disagree with, I still want to hear your thoughts anyway. This is something that I wanted to ask you guys before we get into it. For the first time ever, somebody told me that I talk too slowly. And I genuinely want to hear feedback. Do you think I talk too slowly, or do you think I talk at a normal pace or at a good pace, or too fast? Because I've been told for the last 10 years of my life that I talk too fast. Everyone has told me, slow it down. You got to really kind of slow down so people can understand you and absorb what you're saying, because I've always been a really, really fast talker. I can talk super fast. I can talk very, very fast. But for the first time, there was someone who said that I talk way too slow, and then someone else agreed that I definitely talk too slow. So I want to hear from you guys. I want to take an informal poll. Do I talk too slow? Do I talk at a normal pace? Because the last probably year or two, really, I've tried to slow things down because everyone tells me I talk too fast. So who knows? Who knows? I want to hear. We're going to just do a quick topic today. This is not going to take very long. I just want to get into this viral debate that has been taking over the internet on Twitter about therapy. There are a lot of conservatives or people on the right. You know, that's not necessarily the same thing these days. There's just a lot of people on the right who are arguing about therapy and depression. Is depression real? Is therapy helpful? Or is it a totally useless industry that just takes your money and doesn't offer solutions and just preys on people who are in vulnerable positions? And I don't know exactly how the conversation started, to be honest. I'm not sure, but I do know that Matt Walsh was one of the loudest voices about this topic. And he was going back and forth with people like Lauren Southern and a couple other people on the right. And he was getting a lot of heat for talking about how he thinks that depression's just not real. He just thinks it's sadness. And how he also thinks that the industry of therapy / psychiatry is just totally bogus, and it's not helpful to society and to modern society. And I think this is a really good topic to talk about because it's not trivial. We do absolutely live in a world that is obsessed with therapy now. Western American culture is obsessed with therapy. They love therapy. Everybody has a therapist. My therapist says this, my therapist thinks that. And mental health, I'm honestly, I don't mean to sound unkind, but I'm so sick of the term mental health. Oh, I'm a mental health advocate. That buzzword has become so popular in the last 5 to 10 years. And it seems like every celebrity and every influencer is telling you to take care of your mental health, take a mental health day. We got to focus on your mental health. And my mental illness is really acting up today. Everything is mental illness, mental health, all the time. I'm sick of hearing about it. I am. Because the more that people talk about it, the easier it is to convince yourself that you have some sort of mental illness. And it seems like every single day, the definition of mental illness just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it can just be to the point where you're like, oh, I'm a little anxious, I'm stressed. Oh, well, you have generalized anxiety disorder. And I just think it's gotten out of control. So this therapy discussion is very relevant to what's happening in our culture today because it feels like everyone has a therapist. I didn't look up the stats, but I'm sure that over the last 10 to 20 years, the amount of time that people spend with therapists has increased dramatically. The percentage of people in the United States who have gone to a therapist has increased dramatically. I'm sure. We could look it up, but of course that's going to be the case. So Matt Walsh came forward on Twitter to say a few things about his take on trauma as well, trauma and depression. So let's read one of the tweets that he said here. The idea that everyone in therapy has past complex trauma to uncover is one of the most damaging lies from the therapeutic industry. Everyone goes into it under the assumption that all of their problems can be traced back to some deep injury suffered in their past, and they'll keep searching until they find it. There's a reason this idea of past trauma as an explanation for present suffering is so attractive to people, and the reasons aren't good. He adds, also, people definitely do volunteer their past traumas. Most people love nothing more than talking about all the terrible things people have done to them in the past. That's why they're in therapy to begin with. So I think what the response that really started this back and forth with him and a couple other people was from Lauren Southern. She was one of like the OG banned people on the internet, documentary filmmaker, I think. She has sort of made a comeback online recently because she was banned from pretty much all platforms. So she responded and said, one thing I've learned over time is that people have significantly more trauma, deeply messed up stuff, than you would ever assume. Second is that the people who need therapy the most seem to be least likely to go or find a good therapist. Doesn't discount the whole thing. So then this started the whole conversation, and Matt responded to that. And he said, if a majority of people have trauma, then trauma is just another word for ordinary hardships that are a normal part of life. And very often the best thing you can do with past hardships is move on and stop harping on them. Analyzing them to death in therapy will do more harm than good. And this kind of went back and forth for a little while. A lot of people are chiming in. A lot of people, conservatives on the right, are upset at Matt's take because they think it's insensitive, and they kind of bring up even examples of veterans who have been through actual trauma and seen a lot of violence and death in their time in wars or in combat, and they're dealing with PTSD, which of course is it's the same statistical rarity argument that you would make when someone's talking about abortion. We're like, well, so you don't support a woman's right to get an abortion if she was raped. Okay, that's 0.5%, less than 1% of abortions are due to rape or incest. And I would venture to say that a small minority, a small percentage of people who go to therapy are war heroes who experienced severe trauma and saw death and people getting maimed and their legs blown off. So that example is not really useful. But so let's talk about trauma. That word is absolutely overused today. And I think that Matt is shedding light on something really important, that the therapy industry, psychiatry, does encourage people to dig up their past trauma and these horrible memories of sadness and grief that everyone in life experiences. Now, I'm not someone who automatically goes down the sort of boomer route of, well, you got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, kiddo, because everybody gets hurt here and there and everybody sees bad things in life, so just got to move on. I don't necessarily take that sort of reductive approach where it's like, oh, something bad happened to you? Yeah, well, bad stuff happens to people all the time. Get over it. I don't think that's helpful either. I actually think that our parents' generation, they were at one extreme, and I think the millennial/Gen Z generation is at the other extreme. So our parents' generation, the sort of boomer generation, is very much like, it just pretend it didn't happen, get over it, move on. And in some cases that can work. In a lot of cases it really doesn't. I don't think that just shoving things under the rug and pretending like they never happened helps. But then we have swung the pendulum all the way to the other side, where people go to therapy because like their dog died and it was this really traumatic experience because they're so attached to their dog. Or they went through a major breakup and they found out the boyfriend was cheating on them and it was just the most traumatic thing in the world. And now I have trust issues, and you just keep going to the therapist over and over again, and you find ways to be upset and find ways to be depressed. So now we're on the other end of the spectrum where we love trauma dumping. And then look at social media. Social media has made it even worse because people trauma dump all the time. There was a post that Josh Lacash shared of some influencer, some dad influencer online, who posted a video of himself crying in the car because he just dropped his son off to daycare for the first time. He had been a stay-at-home dad for a long time while his wife was working, or what, I don't know their situation. I don't know this guy, but what I saw briefly is that he was a stay-at-home dad for the first couple years of the child's life, but due to different circumstances, now he's going back to work, so he has to take the child to daycare. And it was the first day he dropped the child off, and he got back in the car, started weeping like a baby, and put the camera up to film himself and posted it on Instagram. Like, okay, yeah, that's a really great idea. Let's definitely showcase that. Let me see if we can find the video. I'm not going to play any sound because it doesn't need to be played. But yeah, here it is. My friend Josh, he wrote, okay, here it is. No wonder his wife made him be a stay-at-home dad. He's a chick. The reflexive impulse to film oneself crying alone in a car has become an epidemic. Everyone is acting. So look at him. It's a black and white video. His name is It's Josh Miller. And the caption says, after 2.5 years as a stay-at-home dad, I dropped my little man off for the first day of daycare today, this morning, da-da-da-da. And he's just crying, heavy breathing, and just like wiping the tears away. This is pathetic. This is trauma dumping. I don't want to be mean to Josh Miller. I don't know his situation, but this is a great example of trauma dumping. So our generation has taken it to the other extreme where we now find every reason to call something trauma. We find any reason to call something heart-wrenching and just depressive. It's going to cause depression and anxiety. So then Matt goes into the definition of depression. Here we go. The idea that depression and sadness are two entirely different things is the kind of incoherent bullshit that people simply declare as dogma because they picked it up from the therapeutic industry, even though it makes no sense. Kind of like chemical imbalance and gender identity. And then a girl named Philosophat. She's I wouldn't call her a conservative, but she's certainly more on the right in terms of the political circles that she runs in on Twitter. She says, depression is leagues beyond sadness. Anyone who thinks they are the same thing has been fortunate enough to never experience true depression. Everyone knows what sadness feels like. We all experience that in life, maybe even deep and prolonged sadness. Depression can sometimes start in sadness, but it becomes a whole different animal. Depression is utter despair. It's an emotional numbness because things feel so hopeless or you feel so powerless to change anything that feeling emotions no longer degrees any purpose. And then she talks about how people who have depression, they feel like there's no way out. They have no agency to make things better. Depression impairs a lot of higher cognitive functions. The depressed person doesn't just feel sad anymore. You feel dead inside. Okay, all of these definitions that she's giving, to be honest, it just sounds like sadness to me. It sounds like grief. It sounds like sadness, like the deep pits of sadness where you think that you're never going to get out of it. I think everyone has been there in their life, whether it's someone died or you're in serious financial troubles or your child is really sick or you have a miscarriage or whatever the case may be. I think we've all been in these moments before. So these definitions that she's giving, they don't really sound that different to me than like extreme sadness. But here's my first response to all of this, the talk about therapy, depression. Obviously, we can get into the fact that the United States prescribes the most antidepressants per 1,000 people compared to all the other countries in the world. Take a look at this graph. I shared this graph last year. This is, I don't know what year this is from, but this has been shared for a while. I shared this last year on my Instagram, and it was one of the most talked about posts or stories that I've ever done. So for those of you who are just listening, this is a graph called Global Antidepressant Users per 1,000 people. In Korea, at the very top, this is the least amount of antidepressant users per 1,000 people. It's 13. Same with Chile. Okay, then you go all the way down. About halfway down, you're at Spain. You got 64 antidepressant users per 1,000 people. So it's getting bigger and bigger. Denmark is 85 users per 1,000 people. Iceland, getting up there, 106 per 1,000 people. And the United States takes the cake out of all these countries, 110 antidepressant users per 1,000 people. And let's take a country that is similar to us in a lot of ways, even close to us in terms of demographics of obesity. United Kingdom, 71 antidepressant users per 1,000 people. This graph it's shocking to some people who don't know the extent to which antidepressants have taken over America. Look at that, 110 out of every 1,000 people are on antidepressants. I saw a statistic probably almost 2 years ago now that I think there are like 30,000 infants on antidepressants in the United States. And that was as of 2019 or something. So you've got tens of thousands of infants, like 6-month-old babies who are put on antidepressants. Our country has a serious problem with pharmaceuticals, and that is inseparable from psychiatry and from the therapy industry. You cannot deny that. So that is a huge part of this conversation, is that the reason why so many people like Matt Walsh will say that the therapy industry is broken and that it's not helpful is because it has become married to the pharmaceutical industry. Today, you cannot talk honestly about therapy and psychiatry without also talking about the rampant use of antidepressants or the rampant prescriptions of antidepressants. So if we're going to talk about, hey, is therapy actually useful? Hey, is depression actually real? You also have to have the conversation of what role that pharmaceuticals play in this system. And I think a lot of times people are not thinking about that. They're just so caught up in the definition of depression and sadness and trauma. But as we have been redeveloping definitions for all of these words, we've also been seeing the rates of antidepressant use go up and up and up. And especially in the United States, anything connected to the conventional medical system is inherently tied to the pharmaceutical industry. Big pharma has a strong hold on the medical system, whether it's psychiatry or gynecology. Anything under the umbrella of conventional medicine is tied directly to big pharma. So that's also a really, really important piece. And we saw some research come out last year about how this idea of like a chemical imbalance was actually not at all true. And the use of SSRIs and these antidepressants did not help solve this so-called chemical imbalance, of course. And then it was also tied to things like Alzheimer's. A lot of the research turned out to be falsified. So yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to question the entire industry of therapy. And it's perfectly reasonable to question the definition of depression. Is there such thing as depression? But before I start to answer that question, the biggest piece that's missing from this conversation is this. The main reason why therapy and psychiatry will never work and will never be fully healing to people is because it cannot be used, it should not be used in a vacuum. It should not be used on its own or by itself. Because when we talk about the holistic health of a human being, you cannot separate physical health and mental health and spiritual health. All three of them go together. And when you talk about therapy and psychiatry, the thing that is always missing, 99% of the time, is the spiritual component. So the problem is that you have all these people going to therapy and the psychiatrists or even just counselors and psychologists who, treat people, but they're not able to prescribe medication. The problem is they're just addressing their mental and emotional well-being. They're just going in there and talking about their feelings. They're just going in there and talking about their mental health. They're completely ignoring that there is a spiritual side that needs to be addressed, which is why therapy and psychiatry will never be enough on its own. You have to admit and you have to acknowledge that there is a spiritual side of people's health and well-being that has been ignored for a long time now. So, when you are really struggling with grief, or let's just say depression for a lack of a better word, if you're really struggling with grief or depression, there should be two places. Well, let's say there's one place that you should go first, and that's to your local parish. And that is to see a spiritual father who can help guide you, who can help you in prayer and find support for you in the parish, a local Christian community that can help you. You have to start with the spiritual side first. And then there are a lot of cases where, I've heard priests talk about this before, where if someone really is struggling with something psychologically and there isn't a way that they can fully help them understand some sort of mental issues that they're having, they will also recommend the person to go see a therapist or a psychiatrist. But you cannot see just the psychiatrist on their own for it to be useful. And I think that's the biggest issue here, is that people are constantly acting like psychiatry and therapy is just going to be the end all be all. And the problem is that now what therapists have done is they don't hold you accountable to anything. They just bring you in and listen to your feelings and hear you talk about this and that. And they don't even tell you this is right and this is wrong. A lot of times there's no objective morality when you go to therapy and see these psychiatrists. And that's not good. That's not good for anybody. At least when you go to a priest, at least when you go see your spiritual father, there are very clear guidelines on what is wrong and what is right. And that in and of itself is a really good place to start, because people in our society today, they don't like the idea of boundaries. They don't like the idea of rules or discipline. But when you throw objective morality out the window, You make people very unhappy. That in and of itself makes people depressed. They may not be able to articulate it or even see it. But when you throw out objective morality and you let people be their own God, that is what makes people deeply depressed. Because remember, I said this, I think on the last episode, you have two options. The only two options that you have are to follow God and love God and know God, or to be your own God. That's it. And when you are your own God, when you think you're your own God, and when you live by your own standards in life, and you don't have clear rules and boundaries that are given to you by Christ, then you are setting yourself up for sadness and depression, for a lack of a better term. And I know that sounds very controversial. There are a lot of people online now who are like, I'm a humanist. I can acknowledge morality without believing in a God. Okay, good luck. It doesn't matter how smart you think you are academically. That's just, you can talk until you're blue in the face, but there are only two options at the end of the day. You either know God and follow God, or you attempt to be your own God. And so just approaching psychiatry and therapy in a vacuum in and of itself is not going to be healing. I wish I found this clip. There is a clip of an Orthodox priest, a Filipino Orthodox priest. I forgot his name. If I find it, I'll put it in the description, but he himself used to work in the field of psychiatry. And he did a lot of research and had patients for a long time before he became an Orthodox priest. And he says that the reason why psychiatry doesn't work is because there's only one truly healed one. The healed one is Christ. Why would you go to someone who is not healed to try to find healing? Whether that's yourself or whether that's somebody else, why would you go to that person to try to find healing? There's only one who is fully healed, and that's Christ. And we have to turn to him first. And then there's another great clip from Father Josiah Trenum, who says, we are a people, we are a suicidal and a depressed people. And long story short, what he says in the clip is, that's because we continuously turn ourselves away from Christ. And that's because we let the demons convince us that we will never be able to repent. We will never be able to be better. We will never be able to improve our lives. But that's because we've taken our eyes off of Jesus. We've taken our eyes off of Christ, who keeps telling us it's okay. It's okay. Nothing can come between you and me. Nothing is going to stop you from repenting. Nothing is going to stop you from your relationship with me. But so much of our society has been told there's no objective morality. You set your own rules. That is so depressing. That's so depressing. It turns people farther and farther away from the truth. So why would you turn to someone who is not fully healed to try to find healing? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Of course not. So I think that's the biggest part that people are missing when we talk about therapy and psychiatry. And even someone like Matt Walsh, or an equivalent, a conservative Christian host, probably doesn't even want to say that. But we're not going to approach this conversation productively at all if we don't admit that people are not spiritually healthy. And that's really the root of why so many people are upset and sad and depressed. And so psychiatry by itself is not going to help that. Certainly not. And then you think about, of course, the industry being tied to big pharma. It's not looking good. I'm not someone who thinks that the entire therapy industry should just be shut down forever and it's totally useless. And I think that's because I have seen people benefit from it. But those people have only benefited from it when it's been in conjunction with spiritual guidance from a spiritual father. When they are also when they're also going to church regularly, participating in the sacraments, and they have experienced some really, really messed up stuff in their life, and it helps to go to see a licensed therapist. And I myself, I've been to a Christian therapist, and it was very helpful, because a lot of times what some counselors can do is they can help you understand your own, I hate this term, but like triggers. They can help you understand your own shortcomings, what your weaknesses are, what your communication weaknesses are, how what your tendencies are when you're feeling a little bit stressed, or what your tendencies are when you're feeling like your back is against the wall. But the only help I've ever had is from an outwardly Christian counselor who can put everything in terms of Christianity. So I'm not one, I don't know, maybe therapy is totally useless. I've just seen people benefit from it when it's done in the right way. The problem is that the industry as a whole, they just don't do it the right way in general most of the time. So I don't agree with this idea that there are so many more people who have trauma now than before. Like Lauren Southern goes on and says that people were not allowed to attend their children's births because of COVID. People missed the death of their parents or spouses for the same reason. The semantics of whether it's called trauma or normal life hardship is not what's important here. It's the implication of you're a pussy if you want to talk about any of this with a trained professional instead of, I don't know, over analyzing these issues to death on the internet for clicks. I think that's probably significantly less healthy. Blah, blah, blah. And then she says that the practice of psychology has been deeply helpful to humanity, though, in its best forms. I also keep hearing that like the roots of psychiatry are Marxist. If anyone has info on that, please drop it in the comments. I would not be surprised, but I would love to hear more. I just don't know much about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if the roots of psychiatry are Marxist. Who knows? I just think that like not being able to attend your child's birth during COVID, I don't think we should be calling that trauma. I don't know. I don't think that's particularly a traumatic thing. I think trauma is just applied way too liberally to things now. I even hear a lot of women apply the word trauma to like their birth experience. Like that was such a traumatic birth experience. Like I labored for 20 hours and then I had to go for a C-section. I'm like, is that traumatic to you? Is it? I mean, because people have told me like, oh my God, you had such a traumatic first birth because my parents were like on the verge of death. I talked about it in the last episode. My parents were on the verge. I thought they were going to die when I was giving birth to my daughter. It was honestly a horrible experience, but I don't own that as I don't call it trauma. I'm not like, oh my God, I had such a traumatic birth. I just don't think it's healthy to call everything trauma. Again, the answer is not to just shove everything under the rug, but the answer is not to constantly make yourself feel like you have been through some sort of trauma. So that's all I have to say on the topic. That's it. There is a whole lot to say about what depression is. Is depression real? Is there a chemical imbalance? Yeah, there's a chemical imbalance, but it's not because you're depressed. It's because you're unhealthy. That when people talk about the so-called chemical imbalance of depression, they rarely ever talk about the physical health of the person. Why do we keep separating mental and physical health as if they're two different things? They don't want to talk about what the person's diet is, how much sunshine they get, their emotional health, what their relationships are with their families and their loved ones. Like this is all part of your health. It's intellectually dishonest to try to talk about depression and the chemical imbalance without also talking about how unhealthy Americans are. 6 out of every 10 Americans have a chronic illness. Half of Americans are obese. Of course, they're dealing with depression. And the definition of what it means to be healthy is totally wrong in our general culture. We think that because you just eat a little bit less fast food and you count your macros sometimes, but you're still eating processed foods and you're still drinking the fluoride water that's got the runoff of all the birth control and pharmaceuticals in it, that you're healthy. Like a lot of times people who think they're healthy, they're still drinking tap water 24/7. You're not even feeding yourself filtered, mineralized water. And we're going to talk about how, what a shock it is that people are depressed. It does not make any sense. We got to be honest about health and depression. So anyway, if you are someone who is struggling, if you're a woman, sorry guys, if you're a woman who is struggling with health or mental health or so-called depression and you want to learn more about nutrition, exercise, and you want an online community of women who are trying to get healthier every day, click the link in the description to join the shift. The waitlist is open, but enrollment will open soon. So we're about to take 100 new signups into the group. We do weekly workouts, weekly recipes. We're in the middle of a 30-day reset. We're always doing nutrition or health challenges. So it's the place to be if you want to reset your health and be mentally well. Mental wellness and mental health starts with your physical health. I mean, they're the same. They're connected. So anyway, that's it. I'm going to sign off. And that's all I got. We're going to talk a little bit more about trad wives next episode. We got some really good stuff to talk about. And we're going to ask the very important question, why is it that the influencers who are the most successful at inspiring traditional values like marriage, family, homemaking, the ones who are most successful at inspiring those values, they're not conservative and they're not even on the right. Why is that? We'll talk about that next time. Okay, bye-bye.